hope you'll all join me in welcoming Wayne Miller to Victoria and the UHV American Book Review reading series this afternoon. Hi, can you hear me? Does this work? Can you hear me in the back? Okay. I want to thank Jeff for having me out. This is an honor to be here reading for the ABR series. I should say before I start reading that American Book Review is a really important publication nationally, and I don't know if, well, you guys probably already know that, but especially today when more and more really important books are being published by small presses that don't necessarily get noticed by the traditional mainstream reviewing venues. Publications like ABR are essential for figuring out what to read, and I just think it's really great that it's here. It's great, and I'm gonna read from the City Our City. I'm gonna try to slip in 2 new poems in the process, but and I should just say to start that the City Our City is really a book of interrelated poems, and all of the poems are set in this kind of semi-mythologized city that is a kind of combination of multiple cities throughout history. It's thinking about really cities, especially Western cities, as one kind of agglomeration. And so in this book, there are 14 Roman numeral poems that they don't have titles, they just have Roman numerals, and they are interspersed throughout the book, and they kind of trace the history of that imagined city. That sometimes that history mirrors aspects of real history. And then they're interspersed with other poems that are just normal, sort of named poems. Often they're monologues, people who live in that city talking. So just to start off, I'm going to read a couple of those Roman numeral poems interspersed with these other poems to give you a sense of that back and forth. And then I'll, move away from the Roman numeral poems. To start, 1. When a drop of water was found floating on the sand, they dug a well. And soon streets opened outward from the core like petals, and voices came together into houses full of air. Houses of mud brick and straw clustered beneath the ridgeline like the pieces of a dropped jar, until design imposed its will, and men of power ordered the new streets carved at right angles across the natural topography. And soon, building was a profession, and builders were the products of tailors living in what the builders had made. Then the city grew beautiful, its nut-like center surrounded by boulevards and blocks of rooms, and the top-floor windows were beacons to distant travelers. Take me to the bricks of light, they cried, those walls of backlit crosses. The feast. This is in 2 short sections. The feast. 1. The table at which we sat had been destroyed in the war, then rebuilt from its pieces recovered behind the glassworks. The food was sumptuous. Beyond the leaded windows, there were hedgerows budding in lilac and white. When a streetcar passed clanging, I suppressed a sudden urge to ting my glass with my spoon. Being strangers, we had little to talk about. So when at last Adam stood, we tipped forward into the words of his toast with the zeal that only strong liquor imparts. From then on, things were better. We began to laugh. By 11, I thought the night was a real success. 2. I was lying just then. In truth, we were terrified. We watched ourselves twist in the bells of our water glasses. How could we know who might stand to speak next or what things he might say? None of the servers could talk in our language. When an airplane buzzed the street, we all flinched in unison. In the hills, there were distant bursts of artillery, then vast swatches of silence. So here's Roman numeral 2. 2. In the church's stained glass pressed blue upon the altars, priests possessed the power of the bread they held aloft. Nobles' weapons were blessed, and the dark wine the people drank filled them, of course, with God. In a backroom ossuary of monk skull bricks, pilgrims kissed a stranger's femur. What can one say of such rooms? Bodies turned inside out, flesh reduced to stale pink wafers. Yet the spire of the royal cathedral kept growing in its primitive scaffold, workers all day mortaring buttresses, carving eyes right into the heads of statues. And when the scaffold was pulled away, the intricate tower hatched into a world it already inhabited. Street fight. This is one of those monologues I don't usually get in street fights. Street fight. What it was that filled me entirely. The only space left was inside my fists. They came alive with me, as a window comes alive with a sudden human shape. And I hurled myself against that fucker who before was my friend, who again is my friend. Above us, the overpass seethed with the arriving breakers of tires, and when a car rolled past, it honked and cheered us on. And when I fell, the pavement confettied my palms, and I slipped from my hands, so they became useless. Our shouting shuttled between us like a piston, and then we were parched. I found our bottle where I'd left it by the mailbox, and that was the end of it, except this lip, this knuckle. And you, who watched from the window dark, dial tone pressed to your ear. Which of our words spilled into the pillow beside you? What crisscross of circles lapped at your sleep? This next poem is Roman numeral 3, but some of these Roman numeral poems have brackets that indicate that they're sort of like, sort of little snippets of dialogue or text or something snatched from somewhere. And so this, I stole all the spellings in this from Spenser's Fairy Queen to indicate that this happened a long time ago. I should say that, just to set it up, that if you don't know this, during the plague, often if someone became infected, they would just take the whole house and seal them up, the whole family, seal them up in the house in case, someone who was sick could spread the infection. They put a big cross on the door and just wish those people well. So here's one of those people talking. 3. And all was then clear. Some faces hath shadows in them. Mr. Preacher marked the doors with crosses, and ere long there is no wind in me to stand on. Bless us, Lord, with soup and wine, bread and water, till we die. And bless Catherine with her long, thin hands. You I saw, sucking the words from her mouth, the light from her skin. So this next poem is, it's called The Beautiful City in 32 Strokes. So I imagine this is like a paint by numbers version of the city, where you're sort of like brush stroking in little aspects of the city. And nearly every line is sort of numbered, so I'll be reading the numbers as I go through. The Beautiful City in 32 Strokes. 1. The neighborhood shop windows, with their shifting interiors of music and color. 2. Then the dusk light that sheets them with now. 3. The same thing in language. For example, a green orange. 4. Shadows of winter branches stamped through the blinds. 5. And then the last remaining leaf begins to ring. 6. On the boardwalk in November, my lover's body was the warmest thing I could hold against me. 7. We warmed each other, a closed circuit. 8. What Caravaggio knew, the body's bright flash before it disappears. 9. Imagine the archaeologist's surprise. The reliquary held nothing but pigment. 10. Living blue, powdered lapis. 11. And when the first few raindrops lifted the dust. 12. The rain arrived to press it back down. 13. So let's shift the scales through their modes. 14. Or else watch a single chord drag behind it the shadow of its minor equivalent. 15. Would this silver ring still be pretty if it was found in a mass grave from last year's war? 16. From an ancient one. 17. And when the radio announced the invasion wasn't coming. 18. When I held her narrow thigh beneath my hand. 19. When the car alarm died, there was silence. 20. Then crickets surfacing. 21. Now the busboys in the lot cup their joint as they pass it, keeping it alive. They diminish it. 22. A penlight breathing. 23. Impossible to hold a grace note if it's to remain a grace note. 24. So in music, we have the best descriptor of a living human face. 25. The singer sang at her vanity only for herself. 26. Though we were listening in the courtyard. 27. How fog rings the streetlights in auras of breath. 28. How dirty windows do the same thing. 29. A hammer shaped this bell. 30. And thus the ring of every future note. 31. Each glance pressed into the world. 32. Then the world presses back, a closed circuit. That's the longest poem I'll read, I promise. This next poem is short. After I finished college, I worked for a little while as a paralegal in the DA's office in New York City. And I was haunted by this. It's an excerpt from a testimony that I read in a legal brief of a mother going to identify her son who had been murdered. And so I shamelessly stole that narrative. It's called Identifying the Body. At first, I pictured his thoughts resting in there like coals, which properly blown on could be brought back to fire. Against the doctor's directions, I touched his cheek. Then I knew the body was useless. Every side of him was forever turned inwardly away. I knelt by the cold gurney. His last cigarettes had filled his clothes with smoke. That smell was as close as I could come to hearing him speak. Okay, this next poem is a monologue in the voice of a professor talking to a room full of students about a historical event that for him is, an event that he lived through, and that for his students is purely textbook history. And behind him, he's going to gesture to it, is a screen with like a still on it of something that looks a little bit perhaps like the Zapruder film of the JFK assassination, though it should become clear that this poem is not directly about the JFK assassination. And he's also maybe a little bit like not to be trusted. So this is called the Assassination Lecture. He's going to begin by gesturing. He's going to say, "Here's the moment that killed him. Bullet piercing his temple, head thrown back as if in deep laughter. And here's us, the crowd lining the street, waving our little flags, which were stiff with dye. A century ago, we'd be pinkish dots of paint. Now we're these clusters of pixels. I can tell you, because I was there, that our gazes were just cilia stroking the car, our bodies mere buoys marking a channel. Here's the muzzle flash, a leaf catching light. Here's a scream, some pixels darkening. And class, if you're to understand anything of history, you have to see it was the moment that killed him, not the squeeze of the trigger, not the network of phone calls that obtained the gun, not those in the government whose voices threaded the lines, not the lover whose complicity was suspect, not the killer's dear teacher who published those tracts against the system in the journals of the time. Look at the scene, like a queen's slip showing, though she wears one every day. And now, students, in my pocket, I have something special, the bullet, which, as you've probably heard, was stolen from the hospital, then slipped quietly through the populace until it came to rest with me. I'm going to pass it around. Note its weight in your hand, even look for a trace of blood. Here, in our moment, this bullet's just an inert little snout. It will start in the front, then weave toward the back. Which of you is going to steal it? See, he's not to be trusted. I think. I'm not totally sure what that means at the end, but I feel like it's suspicious. This got lost in my book. There it is. Those boys, standing over the open grave full of rainwater, looking down into it. Into their bodies, their soccer jerseys thinned to smears on the surface, the clouds drifting behind them and through the grave beneath where they're floating. A grave they stumbled upon as they shortcut through the field. The grave is empty, they're pretty sure, abandoned when the storm swept in so suddenly. Each pictures himself as he was when he heard the rain on the roof, when the men must have grabbed their shovels and trudged to a truck. Who was this grave dug for, and where is he now? Those boys want to know. Gazing down into the grave's turbid water, a seed pod pressed to the surface, a blade of grass. Now a jet slides in, etching its way. One boy points down at it, then another points too. What do these boys want from this moment, lingering above an open grave full of rainwater? What will they say, and to whom back home, and how will it be explained? Their reflections held so precisely in the windless field. I call this next poem a found poem because the narrative, the story of the poem, I stole from an essay by a guy named Bernard Knox. He's actually a pretty famous classicist. And when he was young, he went and fought in the Abraham Lincoln Brigades during the Spanish Civil War, where, for those of you who don't know, when the Spanish Civil War was going on, a lot of basically sort of volunteering folks from multiple countries showed up to fight against fascism and Franco. This is one of those rare instances where I think that the fact that almost all of the details in this are true, they're sort of too good to be true. So, I couldn't have made this up, in other words. This is called In the Barracks, a found poem. It's a prose poem, so I'll try to read it more like prose. They had been in town only for a few days when the hills began pricking into the barracks, which once had been university classrooms, with sniper fire. That night, they crawled to their bedrolls in the corners, the cold spilling through the rooms like silt. There were no sandbags, and the bullets kept arriving, solitary and oddly quiet, splintering the floorboards, cracking the lintel, the heavy door, tapping around in the billowing dark for just a second to catch somewhere, and the room went dull. At dawn, 4 of the men crossed the courtyard to the library. When they returned, they were pushing carts of books. In an act of uncertain desperation, they stacked them as high as they could in the windows, and that night the bullets came smacking into paper where they stuck. In the morning, Knox took down one heavy blue book and opened it. A bullet, surprisingly cold to the touch, had burrowed into the pages, which he lifted a few at a time from around the embedded snub until it fell loose. The shooter could not have intended to punch out the letters that were missing, Knox thought, yet they were gone. But the book could still more or less be read without them, and he liked knowing that a bullet's approximate penetration through a treatise on the history of Western Europe was 350 pages. That's true. He said that at least with the weapons that they had at the time, about 350 pages was how far a bullet could go through a book. So those of you who read the skinny books, it's a big mistake. The wall. All those years in the dark with our rattling spray cans, scrawling out curses at that half of the city erased on the opposite side, as if they could read our words through the concrete, as if what we wrote was for them, not for us. Soon the wall was a thick net of language, a false horizon. It built toward us in minute layers that shifted as we shifted. It mirrored the flashing of our voices. On the other side, they too were writing us. And then it was unclear what we should hate more, those who were sealing us up in their dialect, or the tangle we'd made that had come to replace them. In the night, we could hear the hiss of their paint cans, their sloshing buckets, and we tried to imagine the words those noises conveyed. Who were we but our language kissing theirs through the wall? Who were they but the language we met in the night for a kiss? So that now, since the wall no longer exists, and each of us has a piece preserved on his desk, I must say I'm not sure if this, it's the letter I, if this I came from our side or theirs, which word it belonged to, what thought it once held like a roof at its capital. So my father died in 2008, and when I was growing up, my dad moved all over the place, and so my sense of this sort of big agglomerative city is in part a sense of going to visit my dad in 15 different cities over the course of my childhood. And so it occurred to me as I was writing this book that the book was partially about my father. And so towards the end of the book, there are a couple elegies for him. And so this is one of them. This is in 5 short sections. They're short. It's called Nothing in the Letters, an Elegy. 1. Nothing in the letters of the city outside his window, the bells ringing at noon, the sunlight a pale square that crossed the bed then dropped to the floor, the rasp of traffic lifting through the wind, the cars sliding underneath. Each day, the sky dragged its light through the surface of the river. 2. In the rooms of his building, people drifted in and out of themselves, as he had done all his life, but then, since he was dying, the city closed down around him, to that last room with its dresser and sill, the bird songs joined to the space, the clock knuckling forward, the books with their words all sealed up. There was nothing left of the city but the hollow of his dying. The window was a painting. 3. The words inside the books belonged to the city, the words he'd filled himself with that named the world that was himself, the words that, in dying, he gave back to the city like sparks to the air, no breath to hold them in or push them out, just cells rising among cells. 4. But here, the tip of his mind having rubbed its color across the page, the pressure his hand exerted, heavier then lighter, the black ink lining this shallow canal that loops, turns back on itself, stops sometimes mid-flourish, like the path of a leaf gusting along a sidewalk. 5. Sealed like smoke in a neon tube. I can imagine the smoke stirring, some wind moving through that space inside the script. So this is where I slip in a couple new poems. So if that's an elegy, time passed and I started writing post-elegies, which are sort of, I don't know what happens when you're done elegizing. I'm going to read 2 of those and then a very short villanelle, and that should get me to quarter till. I have to say these post-elegies are not really directly about my dad, though they are about, I guess, people dying. Post-elegy. After the plane went down, the cars sat for weeks in long-term parking. Then, one by one, they began to disappear from among the cars of the living. When we went to retrieve his, you drove the rows of the lot while I pushed the panic button on the fob. Inside, a takeout coffee cup sat in its cradle, a skim of decay floating beneath the lid. I'd ridden in his car many times, but never driven it. When I turned the key, the radio opened unexpectedly like an eye. I was conscious of the ground passing just beneath the floor and the trapped air in the tires lifting my weight. I realized I was steering homeward, the down payment of some house we might live in for the rest of our lives. Post-Elegy. You can see I got creative with the titles. Post-Elegy. There in the image that recurred of a house catching fire in the middle of a hard freeze, I was sure you were the house. But now I see you were the fire filling the house with motion, your light opening the rooms from the dark, paling the oak's curve like the inside of a forearm. When the trucks arrived, scraping their sirens up the line of empty porches, you were already feathering at the soffits. The men locked their hoses to the vast reservoir floating beneath the city and pushed that weight against you until finally you were swallowed back into the blackened lath and clapboard. In the morning, I woke to find the house sealed in great slicks of ice. Waxen pipes on the windows and walls. I passed it each day to work and back home. Once, I went over to look through the ice sheeting the bedroom window. A few of your books lay unburned on the table by the bed, which still had the covers pulled back. No, you must have been the house. Those books were yours. The shoe prints and the snow crust were mine. But you were the fire, too, that swallowed the house from the inside, that the house swallowed into itself. When the ice began to melt, the sun filled the street between us with fire. So this is the last poem I'm going to read. I consider this like a lazy villanelle. So, you know, villanelles repeat lines, and then they also have a rhyme scheme. I neglected to have a rhyme scheme, and the lines that I repeat only kind of repeat. So you can decide if it's a villanelle. I should also say that I have a 1-year-old, and I wrote this poem for a friend of mine who had a really colicky baby, and then I had a really colicky baby, and the poem made a lot more sense to me. So it doesn't have a title. The child's cry is a light that comes on in the house when the street is empty and the trees are still. The light in the window gives voice to the cry. So when the windows are closed, we still know her voice is pushing against the walls of her room. Her cry. A light that comes on in the house, quivering the filaments in the bulbs, lifting her parents out of their beds in the dark. At times, a neighbor's light will echo the cry. Her voice, arriving from what seems to be nowhere, from inside such a tiny body, it comes on, that cry somehow filling the whole house when her parents are sleeping, when the world is sleeping. Like a lighthouse beam, it swings around and out of her body, flooding the window, a cry emerging from inside a dream, a need or fear she can't yet utter. All there is her breath, pushing the cry. The light coming on in the house, and her voice, a light planted deep in the cry. Thank you.
Questions? Anyone?
I look around here at these empty chairs, and I hope you know that our presence makes up in an affinity for all things literary that their absence speaks of. And when you were introduced as having been haunted by emptiness, I wondered what this half-empty room speaks to you, what that says to you.
Well, you know, I think as a poet, if like more than 3 people show up,
I think back to when we were in school and we were introduced to poetry, and we were asked, what did the poet mean? And that always just turned me off, because it was like the words mean what the words mean, and we were given this presumption that we were supposed to get something more than the words said. And when you introduced yours with a little preface, this is short, I kept hoping there was more. I appreciated the length and the words and the meaning there. I took notes. Reducing us to pixels, I like that.
No, thanks.
Looking at a picture and seeing us as pixels, it really kind of honed in on each of us as an individual. And the smell of the smoke. that spoke to me too. Thank you for what you brought to us today, and I'm glad there are more than 3 people here.
Yeah, me too. No, thank you. That's all very nice of you to say. I appreciate it. Yeah.
I'm a senior citizen, and I thought every line had to rhyme and all that. And I have a grandson who has a scholarship to university next year, and he is majoring in journalism. I texted him, I said, do you like poetry? Oh, yes. But it's so exciting, because I thought, you never make a living, you know, whatever.
You don't.
And I love and I love creative writing.
Yeah.
But, you know, nothing really rhymes like from the old days. At the end of the day, as one of the grandsons, and it's just so refreshing and interesting. And today, you know, I'm just really excited. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah.
I actually have several questions. They're quick. Number one, a compliment. You were highly intelligent, and you're very much a thinking man. Quick question, can you be a poet without being a thinking man?
Oh, God. I have no idea.
I mean, or is it just because you're in academia a lot and you sound more?
Well, I mean, I teach in academia. I teach at the University of Central Missouri, but
as a person,
yeah,
you must be very insightful. You have to be.
Well, I like to think that I'm insightful. I don't know. I think that, I guess what I would say is that what I'm really interested in poems are places where paradoxes emerge and answers are not easy. And I think that a lot of people get nervous. I mean, this really keeps this idea of negative capability. I think a lot of people get nervous in a space where there isn't a clear answer. And I think that most good writing, novels, poetry, whatever the genre, tend to emerge from that place where there are not clear answers, where you're sort of comfortable musing about something and trying to figure out its complexities without necessarily looking for like the bottom line, you know? And so I don't know if that means that you have to be a thinking person to write poems, or but I think it definitely means that you have to have a certain comfort level with living without clear answers. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. And a couple of other quick comments. I'm a lot like the lady that just spoke. I know very little about poetry. I also used to think that it just had to rhyme.
Yes.
But I went to the University of Texas for a couple of years. Went here also, I must say. I'm a VC graduate. But anyway, Emily Dickinson really interested me. She is very hard to understand.
Oh, yeah.
What are your comments on her? And then the last question, I'll wait till you answer this one first.
I mean, Emily Dickinson is
I
one
don't
of the...
mean to hog, but they're quick.
No, it's great. Emily Dickinson is, I mean, one of the two sort of founding American poets. If you want to think about where American poetry finds its voice and finds its purpose and its goals, I think Dickinson and Whitman are the two sort of parents of our poetic moment. But I also think that, you know what I would say about that question of rhyme in Dickinson, because I feel like Dickinson is this place where you get both rhyme and free verse. So if you want to think about her dashes, those kind of breaks within the line, those operate, I think, the way free verse line breaks tend to work. You know, they tend to give you the sense of slippage and the sense of sort of double meaning, and you know, you're not quite sure whether to read that dash as like a period or a ... or, you know what I mean? There's an ambiguity that comes from the dashes, and in that way, Dickinson feels super modern to me. But at the same time, she writes this kind of hymnal style stanza, this sort of hymn style stanza that feels old-fashioned to us. And I think she's a wonderful bridge in that way, because she gives us both a sense of like 19th century and 20th century poetry at once.
You're the intellectual, so real quick on that. Do you remember a poem that she wrote? I live out at Lake Forest, near the railroad track. And every time I hear my train go by, I love it. I think of her poem, and she referred to a train being like a cat, lapping up milk on the tracks. I love that poem, but I can't remember the poem. You don't.
I sure can't recite it.
Okay. Well, anyway, I don't want to hog this stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the journal that you edit?
Yeah, I had at Pleiades a journal of new writing, and then we just added in parentheses and reviews last year because we actually have about 150 pages of book reviews in it. In the same way that American Book Review is providing a forum for talking about small press books that are increasingly important, I think, in the literary conversation, we wanted to do something like that too. So we have about 150 pages per issue of poetry, fiction essays, and then about 150 pages of book reviews. Comes out twice a year in January and June. What else can I tell you about it? I'm trying to think of other stuff to tell you. I don't know.
Who's your audience?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that an audience for a literary journal is inherently narrow. You know, we're quite pleased that we have, I think, about 700 subscribers. It's more than a lot of literary journals. And our print run is about 2,000. Our big coup 2 years ago is that we got into Chapters Indigo, which is like the Barnes and Noble of Canada. So we're now all across Canada. But you know, our audience is mostly, I don't know, literary readers. I would say that probably a lot of writers subscribe to us. There's that place where writers are also readers. And I think often people who subscribe to literary journals, especially more than one or two, tend to also be really kind of plugged in to that world. I think of literary journals in general as sort of, well, this is the way I explain it to students when they're sort of trying to figure out what a literary journal is. This is the way it was explained to me when I was an undergrad, is that, you know, if you want to figure out what was being written 10 to 20 years ago, go pick up an anthology. If you want to find out what was written 5 years ago, go pick up new books of poems, right, for poetry, or new novels or whatever. That stuff was started usually about 5 years ago, maybe 10. If you want to find out what was written in the last 2 years, you have to go to literary journals. It's sort of like the starting line. And you know, for poets, then you know, you publish poems in literary journals, and then 5 years later you put your collection together. And so I feel like literary journals are the place where you really get a sense of exactly where the art is at right now. And that's what we want to do. We get between 15 and 18,000 poems a year. We publish about 80 pages of poetry a year. We get about 3,500 stories, and we publish about 8 to 10 of them. So, I mean, we really do get a lot of work, and we try to pick what we think is best. I'm sure other people would disagree. Yeah.
Regarding your assassination poem,
Yeah.
if I understood you correctly, you said that the professor presenting that poem may or may not could be trusted.
Yeah.
My question is, can you be trusted? Was that not about the JFK assassination?
No, it's not, because there's a certain point that I actually started writing that, and I can't remember what it was. It was an assassination, I want to say somewhere in the Middle East that I read about that made me think about writing that poem. And I really,
Similarities, I think.
well, that's sort of the argument of the book, is that I'm often finding, my argument is that, you know, assassinations happen in cities everywhere, that they're a part of the city. You know, I wish it weren't true, but, you know, that over time assassinations happen in cities. That over time wars happen both to and are generated by cities. Over time, you know, cities, regardless of the city, this is a part of the history. And so in that case, yes, most of the details from that, in at least the first half of the poem, are pretty JFK echo-y. But then, but there's a certain point that, I mean, I don't know anyone who actually has the bullet, right? I mean, I think there's a certain point that I sort of take a leap into a world that's clearly not the JFK assassination. But yeah, I mean, you're right. A lot of those details are lifted from that historical moment, but from others too. Does that make sense?
Yes. Jordan.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I teach in the humanities division here at the university. And for my students, they go to college so they can graduate and have a better job. The argument that college is a place where you can learn to be a broader, more enriched, better person is often lost. So they might put up with a class that covers poetry so they can go and be a paralegal.
Right.
Tell us about your journey from paralegal to poet and professor.
Yeah.
Paralegal to poem. There's a poem there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I graduated from a liberal arts college outside Cleveland, and I had been a history English double major, basically. So, you know, I was utterly unemployable, but you know, I could think critically about things. especially places like the DA's office in New York City, you know, they made a point of not hiring, of hiring people who had done something like studied English, because they felt like the critical thinking skills that went into the humanities in general were a better foundation. The way they explained it is they could teach you how to be a paralegal in a month, but they couldn't teach you how to write a good legal brief because you had to have 4 years of good reading and writing training. And I worked in the appellate bureau, where everything was written legal briefs. And in fact, oddly, in New York State, you don't have to be a lawyer to represent someone on appeals. So I actually wrote the low level. They let the paralegals write the low level, what they call interest of justice claims that you could probably not respond and the judges would still say no. You know, but so I was just looking for a job when I graduated, and I applied for any and every job I saw that looked like I could vaguely sort of kind of be qualified. And I happened to just hit this job at the right time. There was someone who had started and quit, and they were desperate to find someone. And so I was desperate for a job, and it worked out really well. But while I was there, you know, basically that job in the DA's office is very low paying because it's public. You know, I can't believe what the prosecutors make in New York City. It's ridiculously low. They can't live anywhere near the city. So I'm just meandering now. Let me get back on track. So I got that job and went there, and most of the people who work through that, within a year or two, they go on to law school. It's one of those jobs that is almost like a paid internship. A lot of people go there knowing that, I mean, or you could become a professional paralegal, but then you'd have to go to a corporate firm where you could make a real living. Most of the people who went through there ended up going on to law school. I published a poem while I was there, and I've been working on these translations from Albanian, and got a couple of those published. And I thought, I should apply to graduate school. I can always go to law school later. And that was my plan, because I really loved the law. I really loved working in a prosecutor's office. I really enjoyed criminal law. But I realized that as a professor, I'd make about the same as a public interest lawyer, and I thought the hours would be better. And so I thought, well, I'll get an MFA, and maybe I'll go to law school, maybe I'll look for a teaching job, maybe I'll do a PhD. I don't know what'll come next, but as long as I'm not paying money to do an MFA, which I think is often a bad idea, I said, I'll just go do that. And then I got into the University of Houston, and that's where I went. So I sort of put law on hold, and then it's still on hold, and probably will be forever. Yeah.
I kind of feel like music lyrics are just poetry set to music. And in regard to her question about your being a thinking man, sometimes I look at the lyrics, and no offense, and this will probably age me, looking at the lyrics of some of the songs today, you think, what are they thinking?
Well, I think that no, this is something that I have a lot of students who show up in creative writing classes, and I teach at a similar school to this. You know, I have a lot of students who are really looking for the job that they get out of that college degree, and so sometimes they stumble into a creative writing class, and they're kind of like, well, I also play guitar, and I kind of want to improve my lyrics, you know. And the first thing I say to them is that there is a very loose relationship between song lyrics and poetry, but there's also a huge difference. And I think the difference is that if I think about some of the best song lyricists, people I really think are great lyricists, I still feel like on the page those often don't really hold up as poems. Because I think a poem has to have the music of the language inside of it, whereas song lyrics are accompanied by music. And so there's a certain sort of music of language quality that doesn't have to be there. And in fact, they have to conform to the shape of the music. So I guess I agree with you. I think that there are surely a lot of terrible lyricists, but there are also surely a lot of terrible poets. But I also think that part of what you're seeing is just two very only loosely related art forms. You know what I mean?
That makes sense.
I mean, that's my sense.
I shouldn't expect the lyrics to be poetic.
Well, no, you still should. But they can only be so poetic. Other questions?
I got another one. I could ask you questions all day. How much in a hurry are we? It's
up to you.
It's 10 till 1. May I
absolutely not.
If no one's in a hurry, I got two more. Number one, I love to hear, I love writers and I love the literary arts. That's where my passion is. But I never got a degree, so there. I've been a mother all my life. Now I'm a granny. But I think life is a lifetime of learning.
Sure.
And I want to keep learning as long as I'm breathing. Question, what is your writing life like? I'm very interested in how writers and now poets, do you write at night? When are you inspired the most? What do you do to keep your education going?
Well, I have a notebook that it's beaten up and I fill, and I have stacks of them that I've filled that I've never really done anything with 3/4 of what's in them. But
Right.
I don't know. I feel like my process, and I think this is true of a lot of writers I know. My process is really about overcoming a fear of the page, like a fear of writing. So I have all of these like baby steps towards actually writing a poem. So I take notes, and then I don't write at night anymore. But I stopped writing at night because I was advised that I used to be a pretty heavy smoker, and I was advised that it's not a good idea to smoke while you write because then you'll never be able to quit smoking. If you want to continue to be a writer.
How about drinking?
Yeah, drinking's
a lot
less.
of your poets, would get stoned at actually.
Yeah.
He wrote some of his best poems when he was under the influence of something.
Isn't it Hemingway who also said, "I never
Yes.
once wrote drunk, but I often wrote hungover"?
I went to go see his place.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, I knew that I needed to stop writing at night because I could not write and not smoke at night. So I stopped doing that. I switched my process so that I was I would write things down right next to my bed before I went to sleep, with no pressure of lineation, no time spent, just like random lines, sort of almost like a free-form writing, and then sleep on it in the morning, get up, make coffee, and start. I do most of my actual writing and crafting in the morning. But I'm also just an obsessive reviser, so once I have a draft of something, I tend to work on it for 2 to 3 months.
Another quick one, were you actually at the Wall, Berlin?
No.
Have you traveled a lot?
Traveled some, but I've never been to Berlin.
I've been to Berlin and I love that poem.
Oh, thanks.
Great. Sorry. Oh, I apologize to the students about the stoning. You're not supposed to do drugs.
Yeah, kids,
I'm
don't
sorry.
do drugs and drink in moderation.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, let's thank Wayne Miller for joining us.